This podcast is recorded on the traditional and unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Coquitlam peoples.
British Columbia, I've seen your mountains high, seen your pretty rainbows and your blue crystal skies, watched your winding rivers as they flow around the bend. To me you're not a stranger, you'll always be a friend.
Coming to you from the West Coast, this is Politicos. Today is July 8th, 2021, and this is episode 247.
I'm Scott Lunenbaum.
And I'm Ian Bushfield. On today's show, a new Governor General is appointed just in time for what's probably going to be a federal election. Talking about it, you will it into an existence, and I think that's where we're at. It's just like a foregone conclusion it's happening.
Everyone's in campaign mode, so yes.
First, as always, thank you to the 103 people who continue to give to this show every month. We can't do it without you. I mean, we probably could, but it wouldn't be with this fancy gear and it wouldn't be on a fancy host. Thank you. You can join them at patreon.com/Politicoast. Politicoast is in partnership with BC Today, British Columbia's daily newsletter dedicated exclusively to BC politics. Sign up for a free trial to have unique coverage of the BC legislature delivered to your inbox every morning. Listeners to Politicoast enter the offer code CITIZEN for access to a special rate. For your free 2-week trial of the newsletter, go to politicstoday.news/free-trial. We wanted to let you know about a new podcast, The Peak Weekly. Each week, The Peak's Brett Chang and Alex Blumenstein talk to the most interesting people in Canadian business. Featuring interviews with Canadian leaders in tech, culture, and finance, The Peak Weekly is the fastest way to get smarter about business. You can subscribe to it wherever you listen to podcasts. Just search for The Peak Weekly. Let's jump into the first segment, a hopefully less embarrassing pick. We have a new Governor General. I thought when Julie Payette was announced that an astronaut was a woman astronaut. It seemed really good on paper. And once again, Mary Simon seems amazing on paper. Are we going to be disappointed?
I don't think so. For one thing, I think the government learned their lesson that you actually should do even a cursory vetting before announcing a Governor General and not just because Chrétien leans over in one meeting and throws a name out. And which apparently is how Payette's name got into the running last time. And also because Mary Simon, by all accounts, is a very well-respected leader of her community and who was rumored to be on the 2010 shortlist for the appointment that ultimately went to David Johnston.
Yeah, this is quite the impressive resume. Simon is an Inuit woman. She was born in Nunavut, Quebec. That's a region. I saw the jurisdiction name, the municipal name, and I'm not going to try and butcher it. She did, as a child, attend a federal day school. Those were distinct but related to residential schools. Essentially, they were ones, I guess, you didn't stay overnight, but you were still often forced to attend and learn English, and generally, I think they were run by religious organizations. Despite growing up in Quebec, Mary Simon did not learn French, so she's quite notable in that she is bilingual. She knows English and Inuktitut, but may be our first Governor General in a while who doesn't speak French. I'm sure we started with a whole bunch who didn't speak French, but...
I think a lot of the Brits that probably came over didn't speak French. Actually, no, that may not be the case because a bunch of them are various aristocracy types who probably actually did learn French at one point or another. But there was no doubt a period where we had unilingual governors general.
And so I haven't heard any criticism of that.
The Quebec are not happy about that. I think that you're not hearing it probably because you're not speaking French.
That's true. We're quite a ways from Quebec, and I don't pay attention to that. But Simon's resume is otherwise quite impressive. There are a lot of people who don't speak French, like me. She started by working out of CBC Northern Affairs. She was a reporter and eventually a producer briefly there. She went on to the Northern Quebec Inuit Association, the Makiyivik Corporation. She was a senior Inuit negotiator during the Constitution repatriation discussions. She was a member of the Nunavut Implementation Committee. She worked for a while with the Inuit Circumpolar Conference and was the first Canadian ambassador for the Circumpolar Affairs. And she was even ambassador to Denmark. So she has these kind of formal ceremonial roles on her resume, which leads me to suspect she is a much stronger pick for Governor General than an astronaut, for as much as I love astronauts.
Yeah, this definitely seems like a resume that is much more suited to the role of Governor General. The French thing, I think, is going to be a sticking point for a while, and honestly, one that's not unreasonable. Not unreasonable to be concerned about, particularly from the Quebecois' point of view. It's fairly easy for us out in BC to downplay and dismiss that, and I've certainly been critical at times of kind of bilingual requirements that, because of the very large country and the fact that French speakers are concentrated in generally one area, it's actually fairly hard to learn and maintain bilingualness if you're not in the Ontario, Quebec, St. Lawrence, and Great Lakes area, which does skew things quite a bit and does lead to some regional inequalities there. Nevertheless, it is an official language, and while maybe not everybody who gets a government appointment needs to be bilingual, there's been a big push for a while about Supreme Court justices need to be bilingual, and that I'm not sold on for kind of the reasons I was just laying out. But when you're the head of state's representative, for all intents and purposes, the head of state in all but technicality, there, I think, is more of a case that being able to function in both official languages is important.
I almost swing the other way. I think it's more important for our judges at the Supreme Court level to be bilingual, given the nature of the work they do, where they have to interpret two legal systems that come in separate languages, and relying on translation risks some misunderstandings there. Whereas the Governor General's role is super ceremonial, and where it's not, she doesn't need to speechify, and she doesn't really need to have a very public-facing role. So I get the ideal world, our Governor General would be bilingual, but on a practical basis, probably going to be forgotten about in a week. Outside of Quebec, where maybe they'll hold a grudge for a month. Like, the staunch nationalists in Quebec don't want to be under the British Crown. Do they even like having a Governor General at all?
Well, I think conceiving of this as just something the staunch nationalists are going to be upset about, I think misunderstands the general Quebecers' relationship with Canada and bilingualism in general. And there are plenty of people who are francophones who maybe not in love with the whole British monarchy, but fall into the realm that most Canadians do of not really thinking about it all that much and not having strong views on it, who nevertheless probably aren't going to be happy with this.
In any case, she's our Governor General for the next 5 years, pending any additional scandals that come up. Hopefully not.
I think it's unlikely. Most governors general have not had scandals. In fact, the resignation of Julie Payette was notable because I believe it was the first one that's ever happened in Canadian history.
Yeah, and speaking of Payette, she did extend her congratulations to Mary Simon on her appointment. Said it's a great privilege and hopes that she fulfills its many obligations with dignity and distinction. It was a kind message, nothing.
Kinda. She put out a statement on Twitter that was clearly screen capped from I think it's an iMessage. I'm not an iPhone user, but I've been told it's an iMessage screenshot, which feels weirdly passive aggressive.
Maybe she's just not that tech savvy.
An astronaut?
It doesn't mean she has to know how devices work. Just like very specific things. You did do some research into our past governors general to
Yes.
see who they are or were before they became head of state.
Yeah, so the CBC North thing piqued a few people's interest or caught their attention, myself included, just because former CBC personality seems to be a rather common trait for governors general. Like, in fact, if for whatever reason you have the idea that you want to become a governor general, apparently, based on the last 50 years or so of appointments, your best bet is to work as a CBC broadcaster.
So Peter Mansbridge is up next.
He may be a little too old by the time there's another round of appointments, but yeah, it could be him. So yeah, I took a look at kind of the last 50 years or so, and high level here, not every single job they've ever had counted, but generally of those 10, 7 were former journalists or broadcasters. 6 of those are just in CBC or Radio Canada. The other one I think worked for Léger. I cannot recall what paper he worked for in Quebec. By far the most common, followed by 4 former politicians, 2 former diplomats, 2 people who'd worked for NGOs, 1 academic, 1 astronaut, 1 who'd worked for the UN, or a UN organization at one point, 1 who'd practiced law, 1 who'd worked for the public service, not at a senior appointment level, but just in the public service, and 1 engineer. And several people here are counted multiple times because of career changes throughout there. Like the engineer and astronaut are both Julie Payette.
I was going to say that's who I would have expected. Yeah, this is a little bit more interesting of a list than what is the career of politicians, where these days it's 80% lawyers, 20%, business degrees, and then just like a random smattering of others. But it is nice to see, I don't know, I guess there's not really diversity in there. They mostly went through journalism.
Yeah, the CBC particularly. It's the CBC to Rideau Hall pipeline, pretty much.
It's not really a pipeline when there's only 6 people who've gotten it. There's a lot of people who go through there's a lot of people who go through the CBC. But yeah, interesting to note. I guess we'll see if the next governor general ends up getting appointed by Trudeau if he wins another mandate and a half, or if it's appointed by, I don't know, whoever succeeds Aaron O'Toole. Or maybe he lucks out in this or the next election.
Well, speaking of elections, let's pivot to our next section. So the election speculation that we've been talking about for what feels like weeks now has reached an even greater fever pitch as announcements are now coming daily or sometimes multiple times a day from senior government politicians. The opposition leaders are out on the campaign trail, well, those that aren't trying to put out fires back at HQ. And yeah, it's, by all accounts, a campaign that's underway, just the writ hasn't been dropped yet.
Yeah, it's a lot easier for the government to send their ministers out to cut checks and do ribbon cuttings when they haven't called an election, because then there are a lot more rules in place. But very conveniently for me this morning, Mr. Justin Trudeau himself appeared at Lafarge Lake, which is a nice 10-minute walk from where I live. So I sauntered over there this morning, found a nice little seat, and got to watch him and Premier John Horgan announce a massive $3 billion spending plan to inject money into BC's childcare program. This is building off of the federal government's budget and massive promise to spend and make childcare a signature across the country. This is an inked deal, so this is not even just a promise. This is money that will start flowing, with the promise to cut fees in half by next year and to bring all of BCE's childcare places down to $10 a day within 5 years.
On average, not
on average.
Yeah. There's going to be some income targeted on that, I believe.
And this is regulated spaces, so if you're in a license not required daycare, it may still cost more, but the goal is to build out a lot of childcare spaces. It's to really increase the supplements on those spaces and to just get costs under control. Because right now I'm paying $1,500 a month, and it would be nice to be paying much less than that.
Yeah, I'm sure it would. So yeah, this also builds off the BC government's plans and policies around childcare. Not unexpected. I think there was an expectation that the feds would try and get something announced on childcare before the election. The only interesting thing I'll note here is that it's clear that, as far as John Horgan's concerned, the political interests of him and his provincial party definitely trumped those of his co-partisans, because he did not seem to mind going out and doing a big event that he must know is in the lead up to a campaign with Justin Trudeau rather than, say, Jagmeet Singh.
Yeah, when someone's cutting you a $3 billion check, I bet you'll jump when they say jump. Trudeau in his speech kept referring to John, his friend John. It's so great to see John again. It's great to be back in BC with John. Horgan, for his part, referred to the Prime Minister or Mr. Trudeau. So maybe the friendship's a little one-sided there. But in any case, politics aside, like BC in the budget earlier this year didn't roll out significant new spending. So there was this criticism of how is BC going to reach its childcare targets without a clear path of massively expanding. And I think this answers the question. This really sets it out, because this does commit BC to rolling out additional funding. I think another $2 billion of it has to come from the British Columbia government. But it's a pretty big deal. Like, the federal government has been working with BC, and they say they're working with other jurisdictions. I don't know who that would be. I can't see Jason Kenney or Scott Moe or Brian Pallister or Doug Ford lining up at the table. So yeah, it's probably some of the Atlantic provinces. Like, Quebec just needs a check to fund their own program that's already up and running.
Yeah, there's no political win to be made by just going to Quebec on this one.
But at least having this agreement in place with BC shows voters in other provinces that, like, if you're in Calgary right now and you want childcare, the Liberals are delivering, which they haven't done for a long time. But they're also trying to deliver other things. Trudeau yesterday was announcing a bunch of other funding. He announced the federal government announced a high-frequency rail on the Toronto to Quebec City corridor. Not a high-speed rail.
It wasn't initially reported that way, but no, it is definitely not a high-speed rail. It is high-frequency rail.
Like, it's going to be fast, but it's not going to be fast enough to be high-speed. So it'll be faster than driving. I think it'll be like 200 kilometers an hour, which is still pretty good.
It's not bad. It's definitely better than the rather slow and meandering trains that run on that line right now. I've taken the Toronto to Kingston segment many times, and that was never a particularly fast or high quality service route. So this will be a good upgrade, but also disappointing. We're only shooting for kind of incremental, like, baby step changes here, rather than just building a high speed rail line in kind of the one spot in the country where it's, like, unambiguously a good place to build it.
Yeah. And it's also the first steps in procuring it. So we'll see how quickly that can come about. I also saw a tweet that Catherine McKenna was on the SkyTrain today or this afternoon, which seems like she's on her way to do an announcement. So I would suspect we're going to hear the federal Liberals tomorrow, probably by the time you're listening to this, announce a bunch of money for Langley SkyTrain. And I don't know, maybe if we're lucky, UBC SkyTrain, but they don't really need to shore up the Vancouver Quadro votes, because Joyce Murray is a pretty strong for that one. Although maybe they could take Vancouver Granville.
Yeah, Jody Wilson-Raybould announced today she isn't running again, so it's probably going to go Liberal, I would expect. So yeah,
I think it was almost going to be a three-way race in 2015. There was some polls, and I remember Lead Now and some others trying to decide whether to lean NDP or Liberal. It ultimately went super Liberal, but
yeah, the several of the strategic voting organizations who tried to advise people on how to vote badly miscalled that one, and there's a lot of people saying, no, you should vote for the NDP on that one, and that just wildly missed in Vancouver Granville in 2015.
But speaking of Sky, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say, it's not a surprise that Jody Wilson-Raybould's leave. It was going to be a very tough run to pull off a second independent win in the riding. So it's probably a decent time to exit gracefully from federal politics for the time being.
I think the second win is easier than the first, but she cited toxicity in Parliament increasing, which is the same reasoning Inuk NDP MP Mumalak gave for why she's not seeking re-election, and that was a pretty prominent loss for the NDP.
Yeah, although the Liberals higher in the polls than they were in 2019, and the whole SNC Lavalin affair that really boosted her profile, and I think gave her the wind behind her sails to run very successfully as an independent. As more time passes, I think it's going to be tougher to hold on to that, just given the general political climate.
In any case, she already has not ruled out running for mayor of Vancouver, so I might have to talk about her a bunch more on Cambie Report. Did you have any thoughts on that before we turn it back to federal politics?
The only thing I can really say on that is the field is already really crowded. It's going to make the 2018 election look downright orderly and whatnot if she decides to throw her hat in the ring.
Which is a great reason to subscribe to Cambie Report. We've been doing great episodes and would love you to listen. Find out about municipal politics, which is wild.
Yeah, the Senate will get very tightly contested if she decides to run then.
So speaking of the SkyTrain, Trudeau he hasn't announced anything yet, but one person who has talked about SkyTrain is Erin O'Toole, who was in Calgary today. I guess he needs to shore up the Alberta vote. We're not even into the campaign yet, so it doesn't really count as like where they're trying to shore up votes, maybe. Maybe I'm trying to justify it for him. While he was in Calgary, he promised to be a true partner for Albertans. He mentioned a bunch of funding things he would do for the West, including fully funding SkyTrain to Langley.
Makes sense. The outer suburbs are a fairly contested area. I can't quite recall where the Conservative seats end there off the top of my head without looking it up, but they're going to be fighting to hold what they have there and try and probably make a gain or two there. So yeah, makes sense. Kind of infrastructure sort of thing is the type of spending that Conservatives are more likely to like than other types of big ticket announcements. Altogether makes a fair bit of sense on that. Well, we'll see if the Liberals try and one-up them tomorrow. If, I don't know, they're announcing another high-speed rail line to Seattle or Calgary or who knows what. But
SkyTrain to the North Shore.
Actually, that would be...
really shore up the 50% they got in North Van. North Burnaby Seymour might be a little bit more challenging if the NDP got stronger, but the Liberals have a number of strong seats around here. Actually, on O'Toole being in Calgary, I should mention there were 2 polls recently that put the Conservatives under 40% in Alberta, and I had to, for some reason, I decided to go back through the history of federal elections in Alberta and see when the combined vote of Conservative or centre-right parties like Social Credit, Progressive Conservative Alliance, Reform, etc., when that combined vote was less than 40%. And I had to go back to 1930 when the United Farmers of Alberta was a provincial and federal political force, and they took a significant share. So if Erin O'Toole gets 40% or below in Alberta, it will be nearly unprecedented bad for him.
Yeah, I do have to wonder how many people in Alberta right now are somewhat dissatisfied and are putting themselves in the other camp or whatnot and may migrate back. But
yeah, I'll note that a couple of those polls had other as a political party, and there was like a 10 to 15% parked vote there, which might suggest the Maverick Party is not actually nothing. Like it might be something that gets paid attention to. Because, yeah, like you said, a whole bunch of Alberta Conservatives are super angry. And I don't know. Alberta is weird. I lived there for 20 years. And yeah, I guess if the Maverick Party gets 15% and Erin O'Toole gets 40%, then the Conservative Party still get 55%. And that would make sense.
Yeah, and that wouldn't be enough to probably lose a many seats on that. They'll still do very well on the seat count. Obviously, watching this thing just has made me appreciate Harper's political instincts and ability way more, because he honestly made keeping that coalition together look way easier than anyone has found it to be since. Aaron O'Toole has not exactly been bad to Alberta or anything, but like even the small steps made to try and expand the party's appeal outside of Alberta has not gone over well there. And it is just makes one realize how tough that coalition is to knit together, and whether it's even structurally possible for a Conservative Party to be successful nationally.
They just need to take a page from the Bloc and have a renewed Reform Party that does Conservatives in Western Canada and a Progressive Conservative Party that runs in Eastern Canada. And they can just have an electoral agreement that they don't compete with one another, but they run on different platforms. And if they get a minority parliament situation, they can hash out a confidence and supply agreement. And then Trudeau has to run against two Conservative leaders.
Yeah, it's tough though for the Conservatives, because to be successful generally, and I do think there's some openings with how kind of the Liberals have drifted in the past 6-7 years or so, that does give the Conservatives quite the option to expand their base if they're willing to go for it. But you can't do that while being a regional protest party, and they just can't seem to be able to move away from that at all.
It's because Alberta is so like ingrained in voting for regional protest parties. That's all they want to see.
And the thing is,
here
that, like,
we are.
You could, if you only won Alberta by 50% or so, maybe do a bit better than O'Toole's doing right now, but still like clean up there pretty much. And yeah, maybe there's a couple seats you don't get, but it makes the 905, the area around Toronto, much more competitive. That is definitely a trade-off worth taking, but it's makes it real tough to actually go through the work of actually getting that trade-off done.
Yeah, the only other thing I'll add on the Conservative legacy is I think there is a bit of nostalgia for Harper that forgets that he lost in 2015, and not just like his government got tired, maybe that's what it was, but I think Canada changed enough that even Canada has changed, and the Conservative Party itself has changed such that I'm not sure even he could do it. If you've heard speeches from him in the last couple of years, he is talking way more nationalistic and not Trumpian, but in that kind of we need to tighten our borders and control our economy stuff that he would never have said as prime minister. So
yeah,
things
I think both
changing.
of those are the case. Like, it was also very clear that the government had gotten tired. They've been in power for about 10 years, which is the natural Canadian government lifespan. So it was just the sort of accumulated baggage of a decade in power definitely worn them down quite a bit. If they were much earlier in their mandate and were facing that same election, I'm not sure they would have done as poorly on that one.
We don't talk about the Bloc Québécois on this podcast because we don't speak French. So there are two other parties in Parliament that are also going to be facing this election. The NDP has been doing a little bit better in the polls, and that's led Jagmeet Singh to start his own leaders tour type of travel. He was in Duncan, BC on the island today. I saw one thing suggesting he was going to be there, and then I tried to look up coverage, and I only found like one obscure article. He didn't announce anything new. He talked about their housing affordability plan, which they'd already talked about in the past. And I think we talked about it's essentially building something like 500,000 homes, a 20% tax on foreign buyers, and cracking down on money laundering and real estate speculation. Basically just taking BC-style policies and making them federal, promise a whole bunch of houses, which will take a long time to get built, and tax things to crack down on demand.
Yeah, we talked about it back then. It wasn't a bad plan, and actually I think one of the better housing plans put forward to date. I still have no idea what either Singh's or Tools, for that matter, ballot question or just general theme is going to be. We got a bit of a glimpse out with an NDP ad that came out earlier, but I'm not sure. Thank me for stuff Trudeau did is really going to be that big of a winner as a message or a reason to vote for the NDP?
I don't think that's quite the framing that they're trying to go for. And I think what the message the NDP will be going for is, you may like what the Liberals have done, but they wouldn't have done it if it weren't for us. If New Democrats weren't in Ottawa, the Liberals would not follow through on what needs to be done. So you need to make sure we're at least there, at least in a strong enough number. And that's a message that they can pivot if polls start to do well, to bring in a strong New Democrat caucus, to bring in the programs, the taxes, the pharmacare, the childcare that you want to see, and we will deliver it. They will either deliver it or make Trudeau deliver it, which for kind of a junior partner is not a bad message. If the BC Greens didn't have the ability to really run on that in the last election, they got here in BC, they got steamrolled by, well, bad timing for them. And they couldn't point to as many like specific wins that they dragged out of the NDP, because the confidence and supply agreement ultimately seemed like the NDP's platform with just like green tinges.
They were able to get a few concessions, but nothing that I think was super politically resonant with general voters. I'm just not really sold on we're going to just be there nudging things as really a winning political message. I do think there has to be a little more to it than that. And I don't know, I'm not seeing it from the NDP. I'm certainly not seeing anything from the Conservatives on what their message, idea, just anything resembling a coherent set of ideas on what they want to do. So it's looking like it's going to be an election that might not actually be about a huge amount.
At least the NDP and Conservatives are trying messages and are aware that there's an election coming. Their Green Party, as we've talked about a few times, has had yet another bad week in the press as they continue to decide that imploding is more important than election preparedness. There was a follow-up story with a bit more detail on how Annamie Paul's microphone was muted during a meeting when she argued her staff should not be deeply cut. I think we may have talked about that before.
You mentioned the muting part. I don't think we covered it in great detail last time.
The staff layoffs have happened. Notably, both staff members of Annamie Paul's office seem to have been laid off. So that's probably not helpful for her.
No, not at all. That's, I think, fairly clearly the party apparatus that controls the funding on that, trying to punish her, make her ineffective, however you want to call it.
And then we get this report that drops like minutes before we hit record on the Toronto Star, where it's a study into equity problems that the federal Greens had in the 2019 election, diversity issues. It was a survey of 63 Green electoral district associations trying to figure out what efforts they did to promote equity-seeking candidates. 29% of those respondents said they had no strategy, and another 35% didn't understand what equity-seeking meant, with the prominent quote, "What are equity-seeking groups? We don't sell shares in our EDA," said one respondent. I can't tell if it's a joke.
It feels like the sort of thing a finance person would joke about, thinking he was off the record.
Yeah, I don't fully know how the report was done, how the study was done, if it was over the phone or in-person panels, or if it was like an online survey where they actually had to type that in.
Yeah, I'm not sure either, but that is not a great quote.
Yeah, and so this came after the Greens ran fewer people of color than the People's Party of Canada in 2019, according to a report by the Canadian Press. The Greens ran 10% of their candidates were people of color versus the People's Party had almost 15%, just behind the Conservatives. The NDP had 24%, which was actually just above the Canadian average of 22% visible minority. So yeah, there were a lot of criticisms of the Greens and having a diversity issue. And I think this survey coming out now is helpful to Annamie Paul's claims of systemic racism and issues within the Green Party. So that's
Probably
notable
leaked by her
timing.
faction, because it does back up arguments on this.
Or her herself leaked it at this point. Like, the
Well,
story
that
about
is
her
true,
getting
like-
muted has 3 sources from the meeting. Like, everyone involved in the Green Party right now has the media on speed dial and is just like texting them every day with updates. It's not healthy.
Yeah, no, this is not what you want a party to be right before an election, just constantly finding ways to make it worse, and so just consumed with infighting that they can't even have, 1-2 days without a bad story coming out, leaked by someone in their party, most likely. Also, interesting item to note that Annamie Paul released the new Green Party Shadow Cabinet yesterday, and notably absent were the 2 Green MPs.
Yeah, Paul Manley had previously held a shadow critic role for, I think, international affairs or something like that. He had resigned it at one point pre all of the current scandals. I don't know why Elizabeth May doesn't have anything. She might choose to focus on being the parliamentary House leader. I could see that being her focus. Although now, I was going to say now that it's summer, but the Greens would see themselves as taking these roles into the fall and into another legislative session. So, yeah, the leader really should have at least one caucus member on side, and the other can be the House leader. But
yeah, it's not a great spot when your entire caucus is shut out of your shadow cabinet, and a bunch of people who, I don't know, may or may not have good backgrounds. I have not dug into all of this, but regardless, like, when none of them are there, that's not a great sign at all for kind of a healthy relationship between the party and the leader. Okay, so I'm looking this up on the Internet Archive from the old version of the webpage listeners. It's like there, as of March 6th, there wasn't actually any MPs in the cabinet either, or shadow cabinet either.
maybe it's just their thing to have everyday Green Party members be shadow cabinet members.
It still seems weird. Also, they have a shadow cabinet position for nuclear energy, or they did. I don't know if they, which really feels like the most Green Party thing ever.
There's 4 different versions of environment critic. There's like green recovery, there's climate, there's environment.
It doesn't look like that's a current position, but one of the previous iterations had a nuclear energy shadow critic.
Perhaps they could have used that to stop themselves from going nuclear on each other.
It's a bad dad joke.
Yeah, we're days, weeks probably from an election call at this point. Maybe longer. Maybe we won't have to deal with a mid-August election, but it feels like we're going to have one by early September at this point. Yay, that'll be our summer. We have content at least.
Well, moving on to quick takes. Update from what we talked about last week. New numbers have come out from the coroner's office related to the death toll from the heat wave, which now stands at 719.
So this is nitpicked a little. It's a little confusing because the coroner says there were 719 sudden deaths, which was triple the usual number over that period. So it was maybe 500. In any case, a lot of people, like hundreds of people died, whether it's 400 or 500 or 719. A lot of people died, and it raises further questions about what did the province do or should they have done? And I've seen a lot of debate about, especially from the BC Liberals and the BC Greens, about should BC have declared a state of emergency for the heat wave specifically. And I've yet to see a satisfactory explanation of what that would have accomplished specifically. Like, what powers would that have granted that the government didn't otherwise have? Like, I'll grant that the premier and clearly hasn't expressed himself well, or at least did not take it as serious as necessary. There's the quote this week is, "We didn't think of it as catastrophic hot weather. We thought of it as hotter weather," which, like, when I saw it's going to be 40, I was like, that's not good. That's bad. That's bad for a lot of people. I'm lucky. I'm privileged. Even like you had a workplace and you had plenty of opportunity to at least, control your climate a bit, even though you probably don't have air conditioning at home. But a lot of people aren't that lucky. And, now we're looking at a few hundred extra people who are no longer with us in the province.
Yeah, he also mentioned it was him and the cabinet were giddy to end the previous state of emergency, which definitely gives the impression that he was not really looking at bringing one back in for it, which also seems a little callous, I guess. Giddy probably should not be the emotion you're using to describe the lead up to a situation that killed over 200 additional people than you would have expected in that period.
Yeah, so I think there are a few specific criticisms that are pretty strong. BC's Emergency Health Services is being targeted by petitions that it didn't open its 24/7 emergency coordination center until the day the heat wave ended, which seems like a mistake. Should have probably had that earlier.
Yeah, so going back to the powers that it would have given the government, it basically lets them access more resources, move quicker on a few things, etc. Kind of take more kind of direct control over certain things, but it's not exactly clear what that resource would have been that they could have surged in to take care of the situation.
I'm just hopeful we learned something, because with climate change, sadly, this will happen again. And we have time to prepare. We're going to have smoke season come. It's going to be it looks like it's going to be a really bad fire season. The military's already getting prepared to come in at a moment's notice. We're already getting volunteer or offers of support from firefighters from across the country.
I went out and bought an air purifier earlier this week in anticipation.
Everyone will get to use their masks more. You should still be wearing them, but you don't have to, but you're going to want to for multiple reasons. So let's be ready for apocalypse coming again.
The only other thing I'll note here on the Emergencies Act, as I'm still scrolling through while we're talking, apparently the minister can authorize the entry of into any building or land without warrant. So I suppose they could have commandeered air-conditioned areas for additional cooling centers under the Emergencies Act if they declared it a state of emergency.
Man, I wish we had a government that bold in Canada. I can just imagine this headlines coming out of that.
Yeah, it also wouldn't be. It's not necessarily clear that the lack of the ability to do that would have really made a difference. I'm sure if the government came to a bunch of places and said, "Hey, can we, pay you to use your to open your facility up for whatever," people would have generally said yes. And the cities were already had several cooling centers running. So yeah, you would have to do a much thorough kind of after action review on this to really pull out that bit of information on what the emergency that could or couldn't have done.
All right. In terms of mistakes of the past, another one who's looking back on their record and trying to justify past decisions is BC Indigenous Relations and Reconciliation Minister Murray Rankin, who is under fire this week after documents leaked from...
Well, they weren't so much leaked. It was access.
They were FOI'd and then put on Twitter by Hasalem and others. This is an internal memo during the time when he was a negotiator for treaties in 1998. He basically suggested taking $350 million that was set aside for community-based healing initiatives for residential school survivors in Indigenous communities and dangling it as candy to entice First Nations to sign treaties, which, if you've read, I think it's in Inconvenient Indian or a book like that, it highlights that many treaty negotiations in Canada aren't, even modern treaty negotiations weren't exactly these equal partner situations. There was a lot of either bribery or almost forced indebtedness to get them. Like the government would say, all right, we'll give you a lawyer, but we're going to bill you for that. And once the treaty is signed, you will owe us money. You will be in debt to the federal government for agreeing this treaty. So if they didn't feel great, they look slimy, and this feels slimy like that.
It feels even slimier if it's compensation or funds to address the residential schools damage.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. 100%. Rankin, for his part, says he's long stood for the advancement in treaty making as a lawyer for First Nations. He said he worked with Nuu-chah-nulth leaders, including the late George Watts, to appropriately acknowledge the horrific legacy of residential schools in the final agreements. He tried to secure as much funding as possible. It's like he did this tweet thread, and it doesn't really explain the specific memo. It's just generic. This money was there, and I did the best I could.
Yeah, and the other problematic thing for him in this is that this wasn't the federal government directing him as their representative to do something. Like, for the accounts I've seen, it's a memo he wrote going up and suggesting courses of action on this, which, does raise questions of judgment on that.
But it was also 23 years ago, and maybe Rankin's views have changed. He hasn't said they have, so we'd need to see evidence of that, but it does undermine his ability to work in the file he's currently appointed to.
Yeah, and there have been calls for him to no longer be on that file as a result.
But we'll see if this story has legs beyond 1 week, or if there's other things to come out, because it feels like you wouldn't just have one document like this if you did some good FOIs, I wonder.
Yeah, he spent quite a bit of time, I believe, in that role, so there's probably other documents.
While we're on news from First Nations and Indigenous leadership, there's a new national chief for the Assembly of First Nations. Just this evening, Roseanne Archibald was elected the new chief. She's the first woman to hold the role. This comes after a 6-ballot challenge, I think, where eventually the other guy in the race conceded. The system's a bit weird. You have to get over 60%, and it's a runoff system. So they got to the final 2, but she hadn't received 60% of eligible ballots yet. And I don't know how many times they would have taken to get there. I think it's actually like how they elect the Pope, where I think that needs a 2/3 vote of cardinals, but they just keep going until they put the smoke out of the chimney. So the smoke is out, and Archibald is now the new national chief. This is a pretty prominent role on the federal stage. The AFN gets criticized as being, within Indigenous circles at times, I think, for being a bit too cozy with the federal government, and the federal government's eager to use it as a proxy for working nation to nation with the many different nations across the country. But it is also one of the strongest voices for Indigenous peoples in the country. So very interesting to see what Archibald accomplishes in there. Her past, she was the chief of the Taikawa Tagamu Nation, first elected at 23 and the first woman in that role. She was also the first woman and the youngest National Assembly of Nations. She was NAN Deputy Grand Chief and the Mushkegowuk Council Grand Chief. She's been involved in Ontario government relations for quite a while, most recently on Ontario's Vaccine Distribution Task Force. Notably, Premier Doug Ford touts her as his incredible relationship when he's asked about his First Nations issues. And I think what's potentially most interesting about Archibald is she's potentially a little bit of a controversial pick. She has been a long advocate for increased transparency, accountability, and eternal reform within the AFN. And she alleges this is what led her to be the subject of an independent probe of bullying and harassment by AFN staff because they didn't like the way she was trying to push for transparency. Now, I'm sure if you're on the staff side, she may have been a terrible boss kind of situation. And it's one of those messy situations. It reminds me of the Vancouver School Board situations where there's a lot of politics tied into the allegations back and forth. But it'll be interesting to see what shifts this suggests within AFN advocacy.
And finally, circling back to Ottawa, there's a story that came out today in the Globe and Mail I wanted to touch on at the end here, related to the Department of Finance apparently deciding that it just gets to decide when bills that have received royal assent come into effect. So this is related to a private member's bill C208, which has to do with some of the tax provisions for the owners of small and medium-sized businesses who want to pass on the companies to family members. The actual details don't think we really need to get into at the moment, other than to say that the Department of Finance has issued guidance that this isn't going to come into effect until January 2022. However, notably, the bill itself doesn't come with a clause or a section about when it comes into effect, and as a result, under standard Canadian law, it comes into effect immediately upon royal assent. So the Department of Finance is basically deciding on its own accord that the law doesn't mean what it says it means.
I definitely get Finance's position that changing the tax code mid-year is complicated and they don't want to do it. They're wrong. Unfortunately, they just have to.
They don't get to decide that.
Yeah, no, I know. Like, I get why they would want to do it on January 1st, because it'll just be easier bureaucratically. But yeah, they'll basically they have to write some code that says if you transferred your assets after June 29th, 2021, you can claim these tax credits. And if you didn't, or if it was before. But yeah, there's going to be like half a year worth of people eligible for this who are probably going to file a class action lawsuit and win. What I also find interesting about this is I think we touched very briefly on this bill when we did our legislative summary a couple weeks ago. 208 was introduced by Conservative MP Larry Maguire. It's weird because it's really about tax cuts to pass businesses on to children, and I can see the value of that for farmers, and I can see why Conservatives would like that. What I don't really understand is why the NDP Bloc and Greens voted for it.
Well, the Bloc represents a bunch of kind of rural areas in Quebec. There's probably a bunch of farmers there that would have supported it, as well as probably a bunch of like small businessy types in Quebec. I don't have a great sense about how they break down on the vote.
Okay, sorry. Let me be clear. I don't understand why the NDP voted for this, other than maybe like small business and stick it to the Liberals.
I think it's probably a small business thing, and I don't know, maybe a desire to be politically cognizant of the whole kerfuffle that came about in 2019 under then Minister Bill Marneau when they tried to change the tax rules around small businesses, and that absolutely exploded in the Liberals' faces. And maybe the NDP just decided they didn't want to get caught up in that again if it became a whole thing.
Yeah. It lacks ideological coherence, because if I'm thinking from the left, I would want to reduce intergenerational wealth transfers, because that's a leading cause of inequity in this country as someone who is a beneficiary of intergenerational wealth transfers. The political calculations probably won out in their minds, and cheering, yay, small business, even though we could enumerate many conservative and leftist reasons not to support small business. But
or not to, I wouldn't say not to support them. I wouldn't say not. I would say not to grant them special status on that. But yeah, I particularly wanted to touch on this mostly because this is part of an ongoing trend that's, I think, been particularly noteworthy in the last couple months. And we touched on this related to the document fight between Parliament and Public Health, PHAC, on the documents related to the two scientists in the Winnipeg lab. And that there's a very worrying trend of the institutional and kind of constitutional order of Canada being fairly significantly eroded, as first PHAC and now Finance have basically decided to take it upon themselves, or decided to do so under the Liberal minister's directions, to basically take over the roles that Parliament is very explicitly granted the powers to do.
It's treason, then, as Senator Palpatine would say.
And that has been Politicoast. Find links to everything we talked about at politicoast.ca. Support the show and get access to our Slack channel at patreon.com/Politicoast. Our intro music credit is Beautiful British Columbia by Serge Plotnikov. Politicoast is a production of Legend Boot Media, and editing services are provided by CHLY 101.7 FM in Nanaimo. Wash your hands and stay home. Thanks for listening.